Right, so in this video we're going to go over the array modifier and how we can use that to repeat detail and the varying pros and cons, right? So let's say I'm making a fence of some kind and I have this wooden post, right? And I would like this wooden post to repeat a few times down some direction, right? I can add a modifier here, search for array. It is also in the generate, top of the generate list. And what it's going to do is it's going to make our cube a little thicker. And I'll show you what's happening, but by default we only have a count of 2 here. And what is actually happening is it is essentially copying and pasting this mesh exactly over by one mesh's width along the red axis, the x-axis, okay? So where's that data coming from? We have relative offset flagged, a factor of 1. So this means that along the x-axis here, see how it's got factor x? Every one width of this object on x, the object will be copied and pasted, right? So if I set this to 1.5, it'll say every 1 and then a half, this object will be pasted. And we can crank that up multiple times, right? The time where we would want to use relative offset versus constant offset is if we want the offset to be fixed or relative to this whole object. So if I was to make some modeling detail here and extrude this piece out, if I wanted this gap to remain the same, that's not going to work here. See how the whole thing moves aside? Because the total width of this object on X is multiplied by 1.5 and then used to position the subsequent elements, right? So what we would do instead is we would untick relative offset, we would go constant offset, and we would type, say, I don't know, 0.5 meters or something like that, or maybe less, right? But once we've dialed it into what we need it to be, this is now a constant offset. So I can now change the width and dimensions of these other ones, right? And it's not going to offset like it was with relative offset. We can also control the different axes. So I can say I want you to offset by, some amount on x. We'll say 0.5 meters on x, and then I want you to also offset by negative 10 centimeters on y. So the copy and pasting will go, over 0.5 and then down 0.1. And so you're going to get this effective moving off this way. So you could, if you took these and rotated them, scaled them down and changed their size, you could imagine making a staircase with these pretty easily, right? Now this differs from the more copy paste approach, right, with using Shift D to place these. And even if we used Shift D and then Shift R to repeat last, if we make an edit now, it's not going to necessarily go to the rest. So even if we use duplicate linked, it's still not quite exactly the same result as using the array modifier, right? The array modifier doesn't use multiple objects to achieve its effect. This is still one final object, and if I apply this, it's all just mesh here ready to go, right? So keep that in mind. It's a bit different from actually copying and pasting the objects yourself, right? We also have something else that's very interesting. I'm just going to clear up all this data and shrink it down. We have something called an object offset, right? So this is a standard sort of directional offset. And if I rotate this object, that direction is in local space, so it's gonna, it's gonna go off in the x-axis direction of this object. But I can instead specify I want to offset by another object, and you can actually stack these together, right? But typically you would only have one on at one time. But we can specify another object and say I want to offset by sort of the difference from here to here, right? So if I go object offset and I click the eyedropper and I click the empty, it's basically going to say the offset between these two transforms, right? Between this transform and this transform, which you can kind of see in the orange dots, right? That whatever that offset is, continue and repeat that offset 8 times, right? So if I turn that back on, I can move this up, I can move this down, I can also scale it, right? Because the offset between these two transforms factors scale and rotation. Do you see that? So using object offset is a really powerful way to use the array modifier and get a bunch of different behaviors, right? You know, you could imagine using this for some sort of a spiral staircase or like solar system or something of that nature, right? The other really powerful way we can use the array modifier is in conjunction with curves. Okay, so I'm going to clear all this. I'm going to make a new mesh, and I'm just going to maybe stretch it along X and do something like, I just need to give it some detail that we can observe. So, you know, break those, give this a interior face, sorry, like a, make almost like a chain link, right? And now I'm also going to add a curve. I'm going to edit this curve and just give it a little bit of, you know, a little bit of detail, right? And it can go up and that kind of thing, right? I can now add an array modifier first and say, instead of a fixed count of 2, right? I can say your count will be whatever is required to fit this curve. Whatever the length of this curve is how many of these will be pasted. And so if I shrink this down, do you actually see how it's adding like more and more at this end? If I keep making this chain smaller and smaller and smaller, because it's always going to copy and paste enough so that the total length is equal to this curve, right? We can then actually add a curve modifier and select that path object. And so now we have a really powerful procedural tool where if I modify the curve itself and make it longer, the array modifier is going to continually place more chains around, and the curve modifier is going to continually manipulate them into that position. And this will respect tilt from the curve modifier and radius. All right? So this is a really, really powerful way to make chains. But you do need to pay attention to the forward axis of the object, right? When I made this object, it was pasting the array data down the x-axis, right? See how it's like factor relative offset along x? I'm saying on the curve modifier that the deform axis is positive x, so you need to keep that in mind, right? Those two need to match up. But instead of like relative offset, you know, you can still use constant offset. Let's say we'll do 0.2 meters, something like that, maybe a little bit longer. And then I can copy this chain link, rotate it by 90 degrees, and then maybe pull it back slightly. And now we have like slightly more interesting chain detail. And I'm free to make these adjustments to the modifier here, because if I space it out and make it longer, the fact that it's set to fit curve isn't going to allow those to go like out of sync. It's always going to match the length of the chain, right? So it's a very, very powerful combination there. Another way that we can use them is you can use them to make detail going around in a circle. Okay, so if I shrink all this down, actually I need to remember the amount of vertices I've added. Okay, so we'll do 36 vertices because that's easily divisible by 360. If I shrink these down and get rid of everything except for one segment here, I know that if I duplicate this, you know, another 35 times in a circle, that's going to meet up and make like a full circle, right? So if I was to add an object, just an empty here, and rotate this by 10 degrees, right? I can use that object offset factor and say I want to offset by this object's transform, and that's created a piece now around this circle. And because I measured out my initial circle's width, I know that I need exactly 36 copies to go fully across like that, right? Now what I can do is I can begin modeling and making changes to this initial slice, and we can now start, you know, repeating that detail around something like this, right? You kind of get the idea. This is where, you know, if you're going to be working on wheels and tank spokes and these sorts of things, sprockets, sorry, not spokes, the array modifier set up this way becomes like really, really, really valuable, you know. And then if we want, we can convert that to mesh, remove all the double upping vertices, extrude this out, and now we've got like a saw blade, right? But I'll Control Z that a little bit because in order to do that, I had to remove the verts. We have the ability to do that just in here, right? So I'll make a copy of this, move this over here. This is the applied version. If I grab this piece and use Control plus on the numpad to expand my selection, or if I mouse over any and tap L, you can see how it's actually just made, like, it's just copied the piece. It hasn't like merged them together. This button here will actually physically merge the pasted copies, but then if it gets all the way around to the start again and loops, like, it won't have actually copied the front and end. If I grow my selection here, oops, sorry, let me grab that one and lift it. There, see that there? See how all these other ones have like moved together because their central point is pasted together, but there's a gap here between the first and the last instance. That's what this button fixes, first and last copies. So if we want everything to be merged together, we would say, right, we're actually gonna merge. We're gonna merge by this distance, and we're going to merge the first and last copies, right? Now, if I start moving these around, every one of these individual copies will be actually merged together properly, right? So that's the array modifier. Really powerful, you know, really common modifier. You're going to use it all the time.